Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and it really is a great privilege to be speaking here today in such a distinguished company. Now, unlike my colleagues who have just spoken, I'm very far from being an expert in neurobiology. I am instead a paleontologist, and I've spent much of my career studying the physical evidence for human evolution. But inevitably, I think anybody doing this has to become fascinated in the end by how people became the extraordinary cognitive entities that they are. Because despite our many physical peculiarities, most of which stem from our rather unusual way of getting around, there's very little question that what distinguishes us most significantly, even from our closest primate relatives, is a distinctive way in which we process information. Now, my colleagues this afternoon have been concerned with the many ways in which intelligence expresses itself in non-human animals and how certain aspects of intelligence are generated among humans. And they've been particularly concerned with the use of tools, which is also undoubtedly the most striking way in which we use our remarkable manual dexterity. But although the capacity for making and using tools is very clearly an important part of the intellectual cognitive substrate on which our unusual mental abilities are based, hominid toolmaking is actually a very ancient behavior that does not appear to be directly related to the unusual way in which we manipulate information today. And that mode of information processing that we have today is often referred to as thinking symbolically. And that is because what we clearly do in our heads is to dissect our exterior and interior worlds into a vocabulary of discrete mental symbols. And then we can rearrange those symbols according to a set of rules to imagine alternate versions of the world. We don't just live in the world that nature presents to us. We live a large part of the time in the world as we recreate it in our heads. And as far as we know, no other organism does this. Now, of course, saying this is not to suggest that the intuitive cognitive processes of other primates and other organisms in general cannot be very complex indeed. In fact, many animals can readily recognize and respond to symbols. And apes, great apes, can even use symbols additively to make and to understand simple statements like take red ball outside, as these bonobos appear to have done in this picture here. But what apes evidently do not do is to engender those multiple alternatives by rearranging those symbols in our human fashion. And as a result, there's a narrow but hugely significant gulf between the cognitive styles of human beings and all other organisms. Yet, of course, at the same time, there can be no rational doubt at all that our symbolic and linguistic species is descended from an ancestor that was neither of these things. So, at some point in our evolution, that symbolic and linguistic gulf must have been bridged. That much, I think, everybody can agree on. But views on how and when that bridging was done vary enormously. Some people favor the view that this transition was achieved gradually as a result of natural selection over the eons, whereas others prefer to see it as a short-term sudden event. And which of these two possibilities you accept matters enormously for our own view of ourselves, because if the transition was gradual, we're obliged to see our modern human condition as having somehow been fine-tuned by nature, which in turn suggests that we are somehow biologically specified to behave in the ways in which we do. Whereas, if the cognitive gulf was bridged instead in some kind of a short-term event, our unique cognitive properties are much more likely to emerge as being both adventitious and emergent. And maybe that implies that we have rather more individual responsibilities for our behaviors. So here's our two alternatives. And how do we choose between them? Well, for a whole bunch of reasons that there's no time to go into right now, only empirical evidence is going to help us here. And one obvious place to start is by looking at fossil brain endocasts like these. There are many, many endocasts available now of the outside form of the brains of a very large range of our ancient ancestors. But as our Columbia colleague Ralph Holloway, who's the leading expert on endocasts, would readily admit, while brain size and morphology can tell us a good deal, there's a lot to be learned from studying things like this. What you cannot learn is what was going on in the inside of the brain and how that brain was organized. So while expanding brain sizes of hominids over time, something that very definitely occurred over the last couple of million years, while this may indicate increasing intelligence in some general kind of a way, we have to remember, I think, at the same time, that high intelligence comes in many different forms. And not all of those forms are symbolic, as our intelligence is. Now, an alternative way of inferring the evolutionary pattern that produced us is to look at the overall form of the human family tree that you see here. And as you can readily perceive, that tree is very bushy indeed. Typically, multiple hominid lineages flourished in parallel, with as many as 7 or 8 of them coexisting at the same time. And this takes us a very long way from the old story of a single-minded struggle from primitiveness to perfection within a central lineage leading to Homo sapiens that many of us were taught when we were back in college. And it's also instructive to note here how this phylogeny that we see here fails to map onto the pattern of behavioral innovation among hominids as we see documented in the archaeological record. Because certainly, as reflected in the stone tools that make up most of the Paleolithic, that is to say the Stone Age, the Old Stone Age archaeological record, innovations in the cultural and the biological realms have been out of phase consistently. New technologies do not appear to have coincided with the appearance on the scene of new hominid species. And that, of course, makes very good sense, because obviously any cultural innovation must start with an individual, and that individual must belong to an established and existing species. So new species, in other words, this is the point I'm trying to make, may be born with new cultural potentials, but those potentials have typically to wait to be discovered and exploited by the organisms that possess them. Now, because stone tools like these constitute so much of the archaeological record, many researchers have sought evidence of the evolution of the modern cognitive style in those tools as made by our ancient ancestors. And as you can see from top left to from bottom left to top right, over time those tools became a great deal more a great deal more complex, both in concept and in the means used to manufacture them. But that change that we see here was both stepwise and rare. And it seems to me that although increasing lithic complexity is clearly emblematic in some way of increasing intelligence in a general sense, it's not self-evidently a good proxy for symbolic reasoning. Now, that having been said, it's clear that making any kind of stone tool is not easy, as anybody who's tried to do it will readily testify. And many Paleolithic stoneworking techniques are certainly witness to very sophisticated cognitive states indeed. But I would actually go so far as to argue that no Paleolithic stoneworking method can be used in isolation to infer the very specifically modern human symbolic cognitive style. After all, most of these Paleolithic technologies, as we see here, were devoted to purely functional ends, and most likely did not demand symbolic capacities to master. And that's a long argument and very quickly summarized. In other words, though, it is evidently possible to be clever and resilient and resourceful and ingenious in the absence of symbolic thought of the kind that we take for granted today. And reluctant though we very often are to admit it, ours is clearly not the only way there is in which to be smart. Now, to cut a very long story short, it seems that really the only reliable material proxy that we have for the appearance of symbolic thinking among our precursors is the appearance of objects that served specifically symbolic purposes, as this image of a horse, for example, very clearly did. And while recognizing what is or is not a symbolic artifact may in fact in practice be a very tricky problem, there are in fact remarkably few examples of the manufacture of even arguably symbolic objects until remarkably recently, when suddenly they're all over the place. Suddenly they are everywhere. And I think even more significant, maybe, is that symbolic thought has allowed us not only as a species with really clever hands, it's allowed us not only to remake the world in our minds, but actually to reshape the physical world around us in unprecedentedly complex ways. And if any extinct hominid had possessed this amazing ability that we have today, I think we should surely expect to see it reflected in some visible inflection in the archaeological record. And quite honestly, we simply do not see anything of this kind until after modern humans had come on the scene. Fossils like this one from Heto in Ethiopia show substantially modern morphologies, modern anatomies, right back in the 200,000 year to 160,000 year range. But these early anatomically modern humans are associated with some notably archaic toolkits, including this hand axe, which is an amazingly archaic technology for a modern human being to be making. And those very early anatomically modern humans are not associated at all with anything that we might consider to be indicative of symbolic behaviors. Now, obviously, eventually, members of our species began to behave in a symbolic manner, or we wouldn't be even discussing the subject today. But it's not until around 100,000 years ago that we start finding the first plausible indications of this symbolic proclivity, again in the continent of Africa and nearby. At about this time, ochre-stained marine shell beads such as these, which have been pierced to be strung, presumably decoratively, stuff like this starts to show up. And while an object like this may be arguable on its own as an indicator of symbolic cognition, it's soon, objects like this are soon supplemented by much more overtly symbolic pieces, such as this geometrically engraved ochre plaque from the site of Blombos Cave in South Africa. It's about 77,000 years old. So what appears to have happened here is that Homo sapiens appeared as a distinctive anatomical entity in Africa at around 200,000 years ago. At first, members of this new species behaved in much the same way as their predecessors were behaving in, and in which their contemporaries were behaving. But by around 100,000 years ago, or soon after that, they were beginning to show this new and unprecedented behavioral proclivities, including the production of symbolic objects like this. And very soon after this, populations descended from those symbolic humans had exited Africa and basically rapidly taken over the entire old world. From Homo erectus in the Far East to Homo neanderthalensis in the Far West, all hominid competitors promptly disappeared, something which is totally unprecedented in the entire previous span of hominid history. In the most dazzling display of early symbolic activity, the tradition of European cave decoration was already underway by about 40,000 years ago. And it was accompanied by an amazing record of this is the image from Chauvet, and it was accompanied by an amazing record of musical instruments and notations such as this, record keeping on a plaque, and portable art such as this absolutely exquisite tiny horse, 36,000 years old. And what is more, this rock image of a babirusa, a local kind of pig from Sulawesi in Indonesia, was recently dated to over 40,000 years ago. And that amazing discovery suggests that this supremely symbolic tradition of representational art in both Europe and now in Asia had its roots even earlier yet, and plausibly, most plausibly, again in the continent of Africa. So, how do we explain the sudden emergence and the spread of this dramatic, of this extraordinarily, of this really unprecedented phenomenon? Nothing like this had really ever been seen in the history of the planet before. So what accounts for this sudden appearance? Well, in this case, natural selection cannot be any kind of an answer, because it's a long-term, slow, gradual process, and we're clearly looking here at a short-term and a sudden event, and what's more, an event that clearly took place within the tenure of an existing species. It was not happening in the context of a transformation, of an evolutionary transformation. And this really leaves us with only one obvious context in which the capacity that underlies this new kind of behavior could have been acquired. And that, of course, is the radical developmental reorganization that resulted some 200,000 years ago in the highly derived skeletal anatomy of the new species Homo sapiens, which we see here in comparison with a Neanderthal. Neanderthal on the left, modern Homo sapiens on the right, and you can see the two are very different indeed. The Neanderthal is actually much closer in most regards to the ancestral condition. It's the Homo sapiens which is modified. And clearly, the genetic novelty that was involved in the origin of this anatomically distinctive phenomenon of Homo sapiens was something that had cascading developmental consequences all the way through the body. And I think there's no reason for us to assume that those consequences should necessarily have been limited to the skeletal and the dental systems, which are really all that the fossil record give us to look at. I think those modifications could well have had sequelae in the internal organization of the nervous system and the brain, giving birth to a new cognitive potential. But even with this new potential, anatomical Homo sapiens for a while continued to behave in the old manner, producing an unremarkable archaeological record. But then a necessarily behavioral stimulus recruited the new potential, much in the same way as birds very tardily discovered that they could use feathers that their ancestors had possessed for a long time before they discovered they could use them to fly. So we're looking for a behavioral stimulus that might have kicked this new potential into function. And by far the most plausible candidate that we have for that stimulus is the invention of language. Because after all, language is the ultimate symbolic activity, and it's very, very closely tied to symbolic thought. The linguist Wolfram Hinson has recently, and I think very persuasively, provided excellent arguments for reviving the view that language and thought are not two independent domains of inquiry. And in other words, among modern humans, language and thought are so closely intertwined as to be functionally, if not conceptually, inseparable. And what's more, there's no compelling reason to believe that the invention of language by a biologically predisposed hominid could not have been a more or less instantaneous event. On a theoretical level, for example, Noam Chomsky and his colleagues have recently argued that the algorithmic basis for language is in fact very simple indeed. And also, of course, as you all know, structured sign languages have been observed to emerge virtually instantaneously among communities of deaf children. And this property of suddenness not only makes language a particularly credible driver of symbolic reasoning, but it also distinguishes it from such rival stimulants of symbolic thought as theory of mind. And what's more, language is an externalized attribute that would have been poised to spread very rapidly within a population that was already biologically enabled to inquire it. So in this scenario that I'm proposing here, language and symbolic thought are pretty much inextricably intertwined, and they were more or less simultaneously acquired in a single short-term feedback event. That event was recent, and it was emergent, and it was ex-aptive rather than adaptive, and it was a random event rather than one that was conditioned over a long period of time by nature. And just one final thought. The notion that the human brain underwent a recent and very sudden algorithmic shift is also supported by the fact that our brains have significantly shrunk since the end of the ice ages about 10,000 years ago. Both the Neanderthals and the early modern humans who replaced them some 40 to 30,000 years ago seem to have had brains of pretty much equal volume, some 12.7% bigger than the average of modern human brains today. And especially because brain is a metabolically very costly tissue, this observation, I think, strongly suggests that the ancestral intuitive brain operated on a sort of a brute force algorithm in which intelligence scaled with brain volume, thereby driving that consistent brain size increase that we see in all lineages of hominids over the Pleistocene. But in contrast, the new symbolic algorithm was a much more metabolically frugal algorithm, demanding much less energy input to produce what turns out to be an emergently different cognitive product. Adventitious as it was, the energy-efficient new symbolic cognitive style, which is based on an internal reorganization of the brain, turned out to be significantly more effective in practice than the intuitive ancestral processing style on which it had been superimposed. And so, paradoxically, in the case of Homo sapiens, and Homo sapiens alone, decreasing brain size seems to have been emblematic of increasing intelligence. And that's my message for today. Thank you all for listening.